Gregory, did you want to impart any rules about time for this afternoon?
Okay, we'll start up again. Welcome back. Hope you had a nice lunch. For the rest of the afternoon, I'll tell you what we hope to do. I want to finish the discussion of credit hour. Going to turn it back over to Beth Daggett from Accreditation, who will discuss the definition of pre-accreditation. And I want to move that discussion up because just being mindful of Beth's time and allowing her to get her portion of it out of the way. You can ask any questions you want of her. She may be around. I don't know what else she has to do the rest of the day, but I want to get that out of the way so we don't inconvenience Beth anymore. And then after that, we will go into the discussion of distance education, which David will lead. And I anticipate that will take some time.
And we still have this placket over here.
And yeah, well, we still are discussing credit hour right now. Before we continue with the discussion of credit hour, just want to add one other thing about this as we go through the definition. You see the proposed language we have here, and I want to reiterate that, sort of going back to what Anne-Marie said, that this language we have here, all of our language, is an opening position. We are not at all averse to you coming up with other language that you think might be more appropriate. So as you look at this definition, if you feel that what we have here is not, everybody's using the term robust, I don't want to be using it too much, but if you feel there needs to be more or a firmer definition, we're open to that. We just ask that when you consider that language, you bear in mind other modes of instruction, more innovative modes of instruction, other than the traditional brick and mortar sitting in a classroom type environment, which this current definition is sort of tied to. So we would ask that you think about that, and we don't. It doesn't have to be done today. You know, you can go back and give that consideration. If you have some language you'd like to throw out there, maybe there's something we can all agree on. If not, we can at least present where the committee is. So why don't we pick up with? Oh, so do you want to say something, Denise?
Well, yeah, just along the lines of that, and some comments that have come up about, better actors and bad actors. Just recognizing if you're going to come up with alternative language, that the department's oversight responsibility is broader than your sector that each of you are representing. So that when you're looking at it, like he said, different modes of disbursement of education, but also just from an oversight perspective, the department has to look at the whole range when we're determining what might best suit for the taxpayers and the students and for oversight responsibilities. So when you're thinking about language, just wanted you to keep that in mind as well. Did I raise something that... All I'm trying to say is that when you're looking at language, there's a range of entities that we deal with in terms of oversight, in terms of applying the regulatory language. So all I'm saying is if you're going to come up with alternatives to the language that was proposed, just keep in mind that there's different sectors that we deal with, and we have to have.
It can't just be for competency-based education,
right,
for example.
We have to look at it from the traditional schools, the competency-based, the distance education, all kinds of different areas that we're looking at.
So we can continue with any comments related to credit hour.
Jillian.
So I just have a couple other comments. I think mostly in response to what we talked about before lunch. So I hope we all remember what we talked about before lunch. I barely do. So one, I just wanted to your comment about accreditors sort of having oversight of academic quality. Totally aligned with that. I'm struggling a little bit, I think, in this conversation because I think credits are really the currency through which federal financial aid funds are dispersed. And so I think it's hard. I mean, it's sort of like splitting the baby a little bit, but I think we need to keep that lens and that perspective because it can provide a pathway for fraud and abuse to happen. But I just want to be clear that I don't disagree with you that sort of the accreditor's lane is for sure around academic quality, but I think it gets messy when we sort of conflate the two. The second thing I was going to say was I don't even know what my note means anymore, so I'm going to skip that one. And then I just want to reiterate that I think it would be super useful for this group if we can provide copies before the next subcommittee meeting of the guidance that I mentioned, which is Gen 1108. And I'm happy to read it if it's useful, but there was flexibility given by the department after this definition was made that I think is really important to addressing some of the needs for innovation, but still safeguarding taxpayer funds. And so I'd like to, sorry, I'm being duplicative, but I would like to again reiterate that I think it's worth considering adding some of that language and keeping the existing definition. Because I'm struggling, I would love to hear some examples about how this definition has inhibited innovation given, one, the pathway for direct assessment, which allows flexibility from the credit hour, and then two, the guidance that the department issued subsequent to the credit hour definition. Oh, and then at lunch, two people asked me if I could just reiterate a conversation that happened from the full committee meeting earlier this week, which was around trying to brainstorm ways to allow accreditors to offer flexibility to institutions who are interested in innovating. And I think they're right that there's a huge tie. There could be potentially a tie-in here if we're looking for ways to allow individual institutions to innovate. So I think I'm making up these rules as I go, but as part of the readout back to the full committee, I think if we have thoughts maybe about how that could look with respect to distance ed and innovative programs, I think it's appropriate for us to bring those back.
The plackets are up for the same subject. Okay, so David?
So I wonder, and David, I was thinking about your comment that regular and substantive is part of the statutory requirement for online or distance education, so we don't have much flexibility in terms of doing anything with that, right?
Not with the basic concept. Now we can clarify it and we can give more definition around it, but the concept itself is enshrined in law, and we have to start there.
Okay, so if that's the case, why don't we just marry regular and substantive directly to the credit hour up front?
Can you explain that a little bit more?
Yeah, so so I'm hearing around the table some concern with the current definition of the credit hour. Maybe too wishy-washy, may create problems, et cetera, right? And yet, when we get to the distance education criteria, you put a lot more definition actually on the credit hour for that particular modality without addressing the issue in the classroom. So why not just address the issue comprehensively?
Well, let me restate and see if I'm understanding what you're suggesting. So you would suggest trying to create a definition for the credit hour that is comprehensive enough to also include a discussion of the regular and substantive interaction requirements, so that we could refer back to it in the distance ed definition.
No, I mean, sort of. What I'm suggesting is put regular and substantive in as part of the definition of the credit hour.
So you would want the concept of regular and substantive interaction to apply as schools are calculating credit hours.
Yeah, if we're confined to it in distance ed, then let's embrace it holistically.
Can I make a suggestion that maybe you could give us a rough draft
Well,
of
before
what you're
you
thinking
before,
of? So,
yeah, before
because
you do
poor
that,
Scott's going to be
let's
trying
maybe
to construct
talk
it.
a little bit about it. But I mean, I do think the department would be interested in seeing the suggestion and talking through it. Sure.
I was just making sure, I'm sorry, I just wanted to make sure that there would be nothing statutorily that would prohibit it, and I don't think there is, but that would only be the only concern I would have from us looking at that, but I would take it back and make sure, but I think it's a good point.
Yeah, I mean, it just seems to me that on the one hand, it's what, from a competency-based perspective, a lot of institutions gripe about. And at the same time, I think everybody understands the intention behind it. So if we honor the intention and are serious about it, then it seems to me that it should apply across the board. And then I think if you incorporate it into the definition of the credit hour, you get rid of a lot of the fuzziness, and more people are more comfortable.
Jody.
Thanks. I just wanted to respond to a couple of the comments. Just with respect to David, I would really hesitate before incorporating regular and substantive interaction into the credit hour definition, simply because regular and substantive interaction is something that applies specifically to the distance ed context. It doesn't apply to the classroom setting for obvious reasons. And so if you incorporate that concept into credit hour, then you'd be applying it. I know for our sector, for the private nonprofit sector, that I'm not clear on why that addition would be necessary, given that you're already dealing with a classroom setting, so you don't have to verify that there is that regular and substantive interaction going on. So I have hesitations about that proposal. And then Jillian, I just wanted to respond to your comment, which I think, again, maybe I was falling victim to Denise's warning in the beginning. I mean, I was speaking about the credit hour definition and partly from the view of our institutions who operate under a shared governance model where any curricular changes have to be approved by faculty. And so there already are safeguards in that context. But yes, we definitely share concerns about potential for fraud and abuse.
Meredith.
Yeah, I guess I have two thoughts. I don't think that the fact that something's taught in a classroom makes it automatically assume that there's regular and substantive interaction. I think we've seen increasingly classrooms where you log into a site off of that they do not meet as scheduled. So I think just jumping to the one automatically assumes the other is happening, I think it's a jump. But I did want to go back that I hope somewhere in here, as I'm listening to the conversation, I hope we can come back to this after we hit direct assessment and distance education, because I'm still struggling a bit, and I can't remember who said it, maybe Jillian, that some of what I think might be the confusion in translating and being an institution that gets a lot of transfer students, trying to evaluate what is what. And I'm sitting on both sides of the fence. I have concerns with the current definition, but I have concerns about making it too all over the place. So I guess I would ask that we come back after we go farther down the list into direct assessment, that we come back to this and don't assume it's a done deal.
Jillian.
Yeah, David, appreciate what you're trying to do. I think, though, putting regular and substantive in credit hour, I'm not sure makes sense, because you can have a correspondence program that also has a credit hour requirement, which by definition, still correspondence programs don't have regular and substantive. So I'm not sure. It seems like we would be creating a requirement that all credit hour programs have regular and substantive, but we also have correspondence courses which don't. So I don't know. Hopefully I'm being clear, but I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not sure, but it seems like we wouldn't be able to do that without getting rid of correspondence education altogether.
If we put a carve out and then that said that correspondence was somehow treated differently. You'd have to have something else that applied in that case if we did it that way.
So then like a different credit hour definition for correspondence education. Oh, dear God. I'm not coming to that in Greg, so.
That's David. This one.
No, I was just going to say that, Jillian, I think, it's done in the law all the time in terms of carving out. So, I don't know that would preclude it. I understand your concerns, but I just think from a legal matter, you could definitely carve out an exception for correspondence, because that would not apply at all there.
Thank you. David.
I think that it's not an automatic thing that just because you have classroom instruction that you have regular and substantive interaction. And so if you do, great. Then there's nothing to worry about by putting it into the credit hour. If you don't, then you should, and then there's no problem with putting it in the credit hour. Now, Jillian, to your point, I had not thought about that. So if there's a way to carve it out, okay. If that's too cumbersome, I don't know. But I don't think that. I think that the presumption is that face-to-face instruction automatically has regular and substantive interaction. That's a leap. We know that's not true.
Russell?
Just a couple of quick points there. to David, I thank you, David, for, I think we need some creative solutions to some of these things and start questioning some assumptions. I'm not sure I'm quite on board with where you're going with that, but I think we need to start thinking about, as we're getting into these, about breaking some of these where they're at. The other thing that is kind of an underlying concern I have, I'm kind of going off on a different path here, is that there's things that we haven't got to yet that have to do with the definition of accreditors and who's going to be a creditor, and it seems like there's a lot of interest in creating lots of new accrediting agencies that could come along. And I have to admit that maybe it's a bias that I have, that I'm probably more willing with the current set of accreditors to allow for some of this uncertainty about what's going to have, or that the accreditors will do the right job, when there's a whole list of people who may be coming in that I don't know who they are. It makes me want to be more conservative at this point, even though I'm in the innovation field. That I want to be conservative about. Well, who's going to be the one who's actually overseeing that? And that it's not only this issue, but there's several issues where I have that I'm conflicted in that way. So thanks.
Leah.
So I'm coming at this from the perspective of a gatekeeper of financial aid, and just from experience, having a framework that backs up the student work and the student learning that goes into that award of credit has proved over the last 8 years to be a pretty useful tool. I'm concerned that we already kind of know the consequences for stripping this definition away and leaving it to institutions and their accreditors to decide for themselves, because we saw some past practices where that didn't work out very well, and we saw financial aid awarded for courses and programs that didn't have the backup of student work and faculty assessment of outcomes behind it. If, consensus builds around removing this definition, then I think we have to look to the accrediting community and the states to what their roles are going to be in reviewing how we're documenting the learning for students. So I'm repetitive from what I said before lunch, but I'm just sitting here thinking about our role here today is to have as best accountability for how we're using our financial aid dollars, and the most responsible course of action we can take for students in that regard.
Jody?
Yeah, I just wanted to respond again on this regular and substantive interaction question with respect to distance ed, and with respect to putting it into the credit hour. I take your point. But I also would, my understanding of the regular and substantive interaction language is that it's in the statute only with respect to distance ed. I wasn't able to find it in my compilation right now, so I'd question what statutory authority there would be to apply that requirement to institutions outside of distance education setting. But I also, my understanding is that those provisions were put in there in part to verify that there was actually a student on the other end of the distance ed program. And with a classroom setting, you don't need that, right? I mean, that's the whole purpose behind regular and substantive interaction requirement.
Yeah, go ahead.
And I'm going to, a couple of things. First off, that's what I had said before. It is only in the distance education definition, but as I said before, I don't believe there's anything prohibiting it. Whether there's a hook, I have to go back and look, because it isn't something that necessarily we had contemplated, and I'm going to have to go back and see. Because you're looking at, we call it a hook. Is there a hook in there that would allow us to do this? So I would have to, it's something I'm going to have to look into. But it's not just, from an enforcement perspective, it wasn't, and Dave can jump in too, it wasn't just whether there's a student on the other end. It's whether or not that student was doing more than, I'm going to sign on, and then I'm going to go watch TV for 5 hours, and then I'm going to come back, and I just got right. I just did my work.
That's what I meant, yeah.
Right, it's more than just whether there's a student on the other end.
Right. That was my
I just wanted to make
intent.
sure it was, because we do have that, that issue too, but it was more of the just signing in and walking away.
Yeah.
In the clicks.
Yeah, I just to follow on to that, the the distinction in the law is between correspondence courses and distance education. In both correspondence courses and distance education, there's an expectation that the student is doing work, the work is being completed, there's grading, and then there's an eventual establishment of how well the student did and did they show that they completed the work. But in the case of distance education, Congress specifically pointed out that there needed to be interaction between the student and faculty, and not faculty, but the instructor is the statutory language. And that's different from just making sure that there's a student on the other end. It's essentially saying that there's an expectation that there is an contact between the student and the instructor in a more substantive way. I shouldn't use that term, but in a way that doesn't exist in the correspondence environment, and that is the distinguishing factor that they gave, aside from all the technology things that are also in the statutory definition.
This is not even a legal matter, but David, trying to think of like implementation. How would you look at that in I went to a large university lecture hall. Did you think about how you would envision that? Besides that, I know sometimes my daughter's professors randomly click and things like that, but.
Well, so, I mean, that's exactly what I'm thinking about, right? So I think we have this bias to think that correspondence study happens only at a distance. But correspondence study is exactly what you're describing when those students are surfing their phones and completely anonymous in a 500-room lecture. And so, so if the whole idea here is about quality of education, and this is one of the ways to guarantee the quality, then we ought to make sure that those students are getting the same quality or at least the same standards apply as the students who are studying online.
Right. And I was just wondering what kind of mechanisms you were thinking about to implement that.
Well, I mean, you can do lots of things. You can, a lot of schools obviously have some kind of breakout sessions and that kind of thing so that there is interaction with the instructor on a regular basis. But it would be presumably up to institutions to figure out the solution here.
That was more of a curiosity on my part.
Yeah. No, I'm with you.
Leah, is your placket up or? Okay. In that case, it's Amanda.
I think I have a clarification issue because there is a difference with correspondence courses and distance learning education. Correspondence, from my understanding, and there's it's written in the definite, well, there's proposed changes also, not in this one, but in the original definitions. Correspondence is more self-paced, less regular interaction, whereas distance learning. So as we're having these conversations about, David suggesting new language, I think the distinction between them for everyone should be really clear, and the implications will be different. So if you're proposing a standard for a credit hour, it's going to be different for correspondence and distance learning. You can't lump them together because they're different, even though they can be done. They're different things. The engagement piece should still be there, but I think having an example of a large classroom and comparing that to a correspondence course is different because it's more self-paced and independent study. Whereas you can make an argument definitely that in a class where the instructor isn't necessarily giving enough feedback to a 100 class, a student may be burdened to be self-studied, but that's not necessarily what we would hope to have. But in correspondence, it's almost embedded that it's a self-paced, independent study scenario. I just wanted to make a clarification. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but
no,
just for everyone.
Appreciate that clarification, and I think that's a similar point to what Julian made earlier about the fact that the correspondence, if you try to include the concept of regular and substantive interaction in the credit hour, you couldn't have the same one for distance ed or the rest of higher ed and correspondence, because that correspondence simply doesn't require that and functions in a very different way.
Marty?
One of the things that I find fascinating about this conversation a bit is while we're having this is innovation, there's innovation happening in the traditional classroom setting. And the question came, how would you have substantive interaction or know somebody who's in a lecture hall? Well, we're seeing more and more universities go toward clickers, and the clickers are assigned to a student. So they can tell we put this question up, who responded to it. If they wanted to, they could track some type of engagement. The flip side of that is the same universities are also going to webcasting the lectures so that the students don't have to attend and they can get them later, that they can listen to them on their phones and things later. So I think in some ways we run into a risk that I know we have a lot of different ages here, but we have people who assume that traditional is as it was when we went to school, and they're changing as well. They're flipping it as well. So they're both moving away from substantive interaction, and in some ways are doing things to try and solve the lecture hall issue. But at some point, I hope we reconcile the two a little bit here. My other piece I wanted to add on in with Russell is I too have some concern as we map this out that there's one pathway we're talking, and I hadn't really thought about it till I sat in here thinking about what it means to say we want more competition among regulators. And I'm still trying to wrap my arms around what that means and what it might breed and how they would compete. And I assume they're competing for institutional business. But as we're having that conversation and leaving more and more up to the accreditors, I'm just worried down. Keep saying downstream, but I'm worried as we look at that we've set up a competition among our accreditors, which I assume for business, and we're saying they should be responsible for more and more things, which means what might attract a school.
Jillian?
Yeah, so great point. And I would say, related to that, as we have these conversations about all these issues that we all care about, I'm not worried about the institutions sitting around this table or even the universe of institutions that exist today that are receiving Title IV funds. I'm worried about new institutions that see a pathway to siphon Title IV funds, take our students, right, because they don't know the difference between your university and my university and Russ's college down the street. I used this example yesterday of somebody else. Russ's college down the street that doesn't have any faculty. But if all of our institutions are eligible for the same amount of Title IV, there's a real risk to taxpayer dollars, right? So I think to your point, as we think about increased competition from a regulator perspective, and then creating inadvertent pathways where low quality providers can pop up. And I get it, right? I represent the for-profit sector. We've seen it happen in our sector where bad actors have popped up and followed the money. And so trying to protect against that happening while still recognizing the need for innovation is a really hard place to be in, because we only know the actors that exist today, right? And we feel pretty okay with that from an accreditation perspective, from an institution perspective. But when we start creating the opportunity for folks to take advantage of taxpayer funds and provide low quality educational options to students, then we're really going to run the risk of casting a bad light on higher education in general. And I would say related to that, and then I'll stop, to the comment earlier about we don't need this regulation because nobody's breaking this rule, it's a little circular, right? Because probably people aren't breaking this rule because they can't. And so I think suggesting that we don't need it because nobody's doing it is just a fallacy. So.
Tony, I just want to say, in the interest of moving things along, we'll take the remaining comment, and then if you want to go back and think about some language to bring to us, we certainly entertain that. But then I think we need to move on we want to get to distance today.
Good.
So,
Okay, Jessica, last comment.
Just to illustrate Jillian's point, I've had over 36 clients who attended a school in New York City that on August 21st, 2017, solicited enrollment for the fall semester, sent the whole school an email, said, hurry, classes are filling up, took people's enrollment, both cash payments and Title IV. On September 1st, 2017, shut down. On November 1st, 2017, declared Chapter 7 bankruptcy. The students who paid out of pocket, that money is gone forever, including students who had to borrow it from their jobs. So I guess I just want to underscore, this is a real problem that people face every day, where people enter this space, and I don't know the intent of what happened at the end there, but it just seems like things went really bad really fast and the money ended up in someone else's pockets. And it looks like there might not be anything out of the Chapter 7 bankruptcy for the students. So I appreciate that point, and I just want to say it's really real.
So as we move away from this topic for now, as Greg said, we're interested in alternatives that you guys come up with, keeping in mind what Greg said earlier, that we're looking for things that can accommodate a variety of modalities of education while still, ensuring innovation in that way, but while also addressing the concerns to the taxpayer for ensuring that there is, a currency that we can use to prorate Title IV aid and establish who's eligible. So those are sort of the twin things that we're looking to do with the regulation.
Yeah, I actually requested that it be printed, and the problem with Dear Colleague letters is that people printing them aren't necessarily people who spend a lot of time with Dear Colleague letters. So if you know how they work, you go in and you get the cover page, but then you must click on the attachment. The attachment was not clicked on, so obviously it's longer than one page, and this doesn't do us any good. So I'll go back and try to get I'll get copies of that for everybody. You could find it if you have your phones. It's Dear Colleague 11-08, which you can find on IFAP or probably just by Googling.
Yeah. Yeah.
We can send you send the link.
Well, we'll send you the link, and then whoever, Scott, I think if you send it out or whoever does, we should send the Q&A that's on the IFAP website, because it kind of recapitulates what's in the Dear Colleague letter, but it's the resource that most schools use when they're talking about this issue. So yeah, we'd be glad to do that.
Okay, well, right now I'm going to turn it over to Beth Daggett, who's going to discuss pre-accreditation.
I don't want to stop your lively discussion, but we thought it might be good just to get this last strictly accreditation thing out of the way, and then you guys can focus on a lot of the other things that you've been discussing. Yes, I'm sorry. It is the pre-accreditation definition. It's still in section 600.2. It's at the top of page 6. So you'll see above there was a prior pre-accredited definition that was struck, and then a new pre-accreditation definition was added. If you'd like, I can read the whole thing out, but if all of you have it in front of you. Just to let you know, the difference is the main thing was, and this is to go back to, Amanda, rightfully so, bringing up, how does this affect the students, is to add some additional protections to students who are enrolled in an institution that's pre-accredited, that, that all credits and degrees earned by an institution that's listed as pre-accredited by their accrediting agency would still consider, those credits would be considered as accredited by the secretary. That if an agency were to deny pre-accreditation to an institution or program, that there would be some sort of time period to allow finishing of a certain either term or the remainder of an academic year, and it still be considered pre-accredited. And then finally, that an accredited institution couldn't go from being accredited to pre-accredited by the agency unless there was a loss of accreditation and then they came back and applied for initial accreditation. That's so that the movement from accredited to pre-accredited isn't used as like a negative action by an agency. Other than that, the part at the beginning is just describing what the status of pre-accreditation is and what we feel that represents. So I'm happy to take any comments, questions, etc.
Leah. Mike.
So, Beth, can you maybe explain the basis for allowing the approval in Title IV access to continue even though denied? Because that's not a provision in place for currently accredited, fully accredited schools that get denied. We don't have anything that says they get to stay active in Title IV until the end of the term. So I'm just curious why we're making that a provision for candidacy.
I think that the administration's intent is that pre-accreditation, there's usually there's a certain time period in which you have to have made that decision. There's also a lesser bar for an institution or program usually to have that pre-accredited status. So for their loss of that accreditation is usually an easier step for an agency to take. And also there's usually not a teach out agreement or teach out program. And as you've seen, there's other definitions that have been strengthened in those areas that wouldn't apply necessarily to a pre-accredited institution. So it was to protect students that perhaps were caught at an institution, and then this would give them the time to continue to finish that particular part of their study, and then possibly, hopefully, be able to transfer somewhere else to then be able to complete their study.
I just, regardless of where an institution is in the spectrum of applying for accreditation, they should know where students can transfer their credits if something happens. I mean, there should always be a contingency in place, whether you've been accredited 3, 5, 10, 20, 30 years. A responsible institution knows how to take care of their students. I guess I just find that language very curious. I'm not sure it's such a good idea, but would love to hear more, maybe from other experienced voices in the group.
Right, and as was said before, is that this language is what had been proposed by the department, and that there's obviously, this is not the final end-all be-all, and the whole point is to get the input. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
David?
Kind of a nitpicky point, but I think important. From what I recall, institutions that are seeking accreditation have to have enrolled students before they can even get to candidacy, right?
I'm sorry, any
institutions seeking accreditation have to enroll students even before they can get to candidacy.
Usually for an institution, there are some programmatics that in which they provide pre-accreditation or candidacy on the basis of a plan for like a program. So yet again, this is what this pre-accreditation definition would apply to, not just institutional accreditors, but programmatic as well. So it's not always the case that there are students that are enrolled before they were to be granted pre-accreditation.
Okay, but let's take the case where they are enrolled.
Okay.
And let's imagine that the institution has an expedited process for getting students through, like some competency-based programs do. It's easily conceivable that the institution will, that the student will graduate before the institution gets to pre-accreditation status.
You mean gets to accredited status?
No,
gets to
gets the
pre-accreditation.
candidacy.
Right. Okay.
And in that case, the student has graduated from an unaccredited institution. And I'm wondering if there ought to be some provision to grandfather those students in so that they can say that they graduated from accredited schools, because when they're applying for grad school, this is particularly important at the undergraduate level, then they are penalized for having graduated from an institution where it might be a perfectly good school, right?
Okay, I appreciate that. I know that that's an area that the administration has been interested in, so I'm happy to take that back as adding that potentially to this section as well.
Marity?
I just have a quick question. I'm not an expert in this field, but I assume if they could keep it, not just for the remainder of the term, but perhaps an additional term to get to Jessica's point, is there a stipulation somewhere in the language that says they cannot admit any new students or cannot take new students into their program?
That's an excellent point. I think that we should take that back as well. Yeah, I would take that back.
Jillian?
Thanks. I just have a couple questions. So this says pre-accreditation, sometimes referred to as candidacy status, but that hadn't been defined previously. Is that correct? It's not like this is a replacement for a definition of candidacy status.
No, it's just a common term used among the accreditation community.
Okay. Can you give more context to the rationale behind this addition? And especially I'd like to understand, as you all were crafting this language, if there's conversation around if this creates some sort of risk and how you've quantified what that risk is. I'd just be curious.
I don't think that I don't have any data sources to pull of any anecdotal. I think it just this was trying to provide protections to students that, they went in assuming that their institution was pre-accredited and that would stay that way, and then the point is that the expectation is likely to attain a full term of accreditation before the expiration. And for whatever the reason is, whether the institution failed to, or a program failed to meet the standards or the time expired, that this was seen as a protection to the students of being able to hopefully disrupt as little as possible the studies of those students, and then be able to provide protections to them, to not lose aid, to not just have it just be a very large, as was used before, chaos for them.
Jessica.
Thank you. I feel very strongly that the best thing for students in failing schools isn't to stay in the failing school. Sure, you can get some more credits, you can finish the term. Let's imagine this is a programmatic accreditor and it's something like ultrasound tech. That's what we see a lot of people in. If the state licensure won't accept those credits, it's not moving the ball any further. I think, at this higher level, this conversation is going to come up in again and again in a few different kinds of regulations we have. And from the position that I see my clients in, a teach out, if done exceedingly well, is occasionally a good option. An option that's really good for people is closed school discharge. And I know that that can be expensive, and maybe that, is a rationale for not wanting to have it. But I would much rather have tighter regulation on the front end to avoid sending a bunch of Title IV funds to schools that are going to close than to have the department worried about spending all the money on closed school discharge. And so I think, I would have serious concerns about protecting students by trying to keep them in schools that aren't really succeeding for them. I don't, it might be 3 months of gain for a lifetime of loss, when you're thinking about it that way. It's more debt, and I don't see that as positive.
David, did you have something to say? No. Okay. Jody.
I was just wondering if, given some of these concerns, whether people would be interested in suggesting deletion of number 2 in the definition of pre-accreditation.
Happy to take that proposal back. From the committee. You can include that within your minutes, but I'm also happy to take that back.
It's been proposed that we recommend deletion of number 2. So if everyone's taking a moment to read that, I just like to get an idea of how you all feel about that. Do a vote of thumbs and see how you feel about that.
Okay. So let's see thumbs up, sideways, or down.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
Leah, did you have a comment?
So if we're going to take out the ability for students to have aid through the end of their enrollment contract, maybe another provision that could be added or discussed, Beth, is institutions in pre-accreditation status that are not certain what's going to happen should have a good teach-out strategy, right? That's reviewed by the accreditor, potentially the state, other potential partners. At our accrediting organization, we require every school to have a teach-out across the spectrum all the time, and it has to be updated regularly because you never know what's going to happen, especially in distance ed. You just never know what could infect a learning system if it comes crashing down. Who knows? So I really think that this conversation about the pre-accredited status and the uncertainty for the students could be addressed through Teach Out.
Thank you.
Jody.
Yeah, I would support the addition of such provisions.
Well, so I think, yeah, if there's no other discussion on this, then yeah, I think we can move on. Thanks to everybody.
Just as a quick aside, I don't plan to just run out of here. If there are other questions going forward, I'll be happy to answer them. And as things come up related to accreditation, I'm happy to answer those as well. Thank you.
I just want to formally thank Beth for all of her help today, and I don't think without her we would have been able to get nearly this far. So again, my sincere appreciation. Right now, we're going to move on to the definition of distance education, and David will be leading that discussion.
All right. As Scott.
Oh, hold on a second. Now let's call for like a 5-minute break.
Greg, are we good?
Scott was just asking if we have a contact list for all of you, and I believe I do. We had all your contact information, so as long as those emails are good and you don't mind being contacted the way you initially told us you wanted to be contacted, then anything we send to you will go to those email addresses. Okay, I'm going to turn the discussion over to David.
All right. All right, so we're going to move on to what is clearly everyone's favorite topic of the day, the definition of distance education. So we all, as you guys know, we already touched on this a little bit in our discussion of the definition of correspondence course, and we can certainly look back at that definition as we talk through this. As I mentioned before, distance education is defined in statute to differentiate courses that use certain kinds of technologies and that are designed to support what the statute says is regular and substantive interaction between the students and the instructor. As some context, the department in 2014 published a Dear Colleague letter that addressed this topic, and it was the first time that the department had published substantive guidance on this topic. In that guidance, the department indicated that an institution could have an academic model that involved multiple instructors and a disaggregated faculty model. The Dear Colleague letter went on to say that the personnel with whom students interact have to meet accrediting agency standards for instruction in the subject matter under discussion. So that Dear Colleague letter is the current guidance for what constitutes distance education. The changes that you'll see here, and I'll go through them specifically, but in general, they're designed to, number one, clearly show that it can be more than one instructor with whom a student interacts to meet this requirement. Number two, establish that members of an instructional team can qualify, even if they have roles that are not necessarily what we might traditionally call a quote-unquote instructor. And then number three, and more substantively probably, and again, I'm sorry for using that term, if you scroll down, we also created much more robust definitions for the concepts of regular and substantive, which I'll get into in just a second. And finally, we pose here that the distance education definition is actually composed by an institution's accrediting agency rather than the department. And that's the last and final component to what the department is proposing here. So before I get into the details, let me pause there and see if you guys have questions about that sort of conceptual framework. Okay. So that is what the department had in mind as we constructed this definition. One thing I want to be clear about as we move down into the language that actually defines the concepts of regular and substantive is that the department came up with this as a floor, as sort of a set of things that we think could be defined as regular or substantive. But again, because we are deferring this definition to an accrediting agency, the accreditor could choose to use all of these things, or potentially have a different concept as long as it fits somewhere within this definition that is established here. So I'm going to go through now what we mean by regular and substantive, and I'll just go ahead and read those to you guys, and we can talk through them. So first, under 2, we have the concept of regular, and the proposed language is regular means the frequency or periodicity of contact, that is, Romanet 1, initiated by a person or group of people, as described in paragraph 3, Romanet 1 of this definition, other than the student. 2, covers the student's period of engagement with the course with a frequency and periodicity determined by the accrediting agency, and must cover the period of time prior to the student's completion of all required assignments or demonstration of competency. 3, The required frequency and periodicity may differ based on the needs of individual programs. And 4, regular means frequency of contact that is at least once per week for a non-term program and at least equal to the number of weeks in the term for a term-based program. Yep, I'll pause there because we may have some comments about regular. David?
So 4 seems to go directly against the stuff above. Am I reading that wrong? So once a week, but then everything else is however often the institution and the accreditor decide.
Yep. Keeping in mind that this is all just proposed language. It's not something that we consider to be final, but what it says is that the accrediting agency and the institution can decide on how often it needs to happen, but it has to happen no less than once per week. So it could happen more than once per week, and that could be a requirement established, but it has to be at least once per week. That's what the language here says.
Jillian? I'm
Sorry,
sorry,
I was just
David.
going to jump in. Just some editing might be,
Sure.
you know.
Yeah, we recognize that a lot of this needs quite a bit of editing before we get to the final product. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry if I missed my opportunity to say this earlier. I thought you were going through the whole page, but I misheard what you said. So just back to what you said about the first part where you're dealing with the definition of distance education as it is. I am confused about the definition, and I get this gets to later in the page a little bit, but do we need to regulate on what members of an instructional team, like what does that mean? What is the definition of that? And I get it says it later, but then the definition later actually makes it suggest that you could have an instructional team that doesn't have any actual faculty on it. So that I have, per my earlier comments, I have concerns about providing a pathway where there's not actually any faculty. And then I would love to hear from your legal counsel at the table about rewriting the definition of distance education, even though it's statutory. I just don't understand how this works, because I understand that there's a distance education definition in HEA, but it looks like we're changing it slightly here, especially.
I think we're expanding on it, like more application interpretation of it. So because I have the statutory definition right here, we pretty much just say regular and substantive without ever defining what regular and substantive mean, which has gotten into some issues with enforcement, compliance, and all that kind of stuff. So I think this is given some parameters to those.
So I understand. I'm not concerned
statute.
about that part, actually. I just am asking with respect, like it feels like a substantive change to, we need like a different word for that, call it something else.
We're going to find one before we're done.
Talking about adding the addition of or members of an instructional team. I don't think that's just administrative.
I think that's an expansion on the department's viewing that as an expansion on the term instructor. Now, if you have views on that, we're happy to take them back, but that is to allow, I think, some of the new areas that people have been dealing with where they have instructional teams, they have academic coaches and things like that. So they're trying to get past the what's the traditional definition of you see your physical science instructor in front of you. It's not just that instructor. There may be other components, as in, I guess, the traditional school would have your TAs or something like that, so that there are institutions that have models where they have instructional teams versus just one instructor with the substantive subject, I should say subject matter instead of substantive subject matter.
So I get that. So Capella University has our FlexPath model, which uses instructional teams. So I get it. We're in favor of that. I think we just want to make sure, then I would love to hear robust conversation about how it is we recommend defining instructional team, because from my perspective, providing a pathway where an instructional team doesn't actually have to have subject matter knowledge or a faculty, which is how I'm understanding the bottom half of this page, sorry if I'm skipping ahead, feels problematic.
Yeah, so just to clarify, we are interested in the views of the committee about what kinds of things need to be in place for an instructional team to meet the definition here. So we're interested in all of your suggestions about that.
Russell?
Thank you. Yeah, this is a tough one. I completely understand that we have this statutory requirement in terms of the correspondence versus distance education, and I guess one of the problems we've had with this is that doing something that is very prescriptive in terms of putting these sorts of things out here absence of any outcomes has been a problem for CBE and distance education institutions, where it's just, we're looking at just what you're doing, not that, okay, I broke one or two of these, but yet students are still learning. And so that's a bit of a problem. Not sure how to fix that at the moment. But looking at your language here, I guess the other part of it, first, thank you for actually doing more to define this than has been probably done in a long time. The problem I always have with regular and substantive interaction is that, including this, everything I've ever seen talks about regular and substantive instruction. That's really what this is, because it's the faculty is the person, or the group of people, the group of faculty are the ones that are doing it. And so when we get into CBE, and we're going to have some ability within CBE for some sort of interaction where it's actually the student who is doing it. And I know that starts getting perilously close to correspondence, but we need to figure out a way where a student can initiate the interaction, and that there's some sort of idea about there's quick turnaround on that. It's not like correspondence where it could take whatever. That it's an issue in the CBE world. The other one, I had an institution call me about number 2, Romanet 4 down here, and saying that the at least once per week for a CBE program ends up being a problem, because they sometimes have sometimes have students who are in by definition an irregular schedule because they're on CBE. So they could do things where they follow up with them every week, and that might be good, but it has a feeling of make work or make do. But there may be something where if there's a planned outage, especially like in subscription programs or something like that, where we know the student and their mentor have planned not to interact for a 3 or 4 week period, that would be allowed, as long as it's part of some plan, or that it's understood that the faculty or the institution or the mentor is checking in at least to make sure, okay, are we still on the plan, and we'll be back in 3 weeks. They felt that they needed something a little bit broader than the once per week.
Okay. Tony, can I go ahead?
Go ahead, Denise.
And I think, as Dave was saying, this was to lay out for us for a starting point, recognizing that we have the competency base, which is one of the bigger issues in terms of dealing with that in traditional schools. But we also have to keep in mind that we still have to meet regular, which is in the statute. So we're open to suggestions on how we do that, but still getting past maybe what Webster's definition of regular is, some kind of frequency-based, and it may be different for competency-based education than a traditional. But that's kind of where we had came up with the starting point, which would look more like a traditional school with the once a week, but we might be able to separate that out.
Yeah, I agree completely. And one of the other things that we're proposing here, and again, all of these are proposals. If there's suggestions about a whole different direction, we're interested in that. If there's suggestions about the specific language, we're interested in that too. But one of the things that we're proposing here is to give the accrediting agency the ability to have as much specificity as it wants to about how to define these things. And under this proposal, an accrediting agency, for example, could say, for a competency-based program, regular and substantive interaction means this. For an on-the-ground program, so for a traditional program that has regular synchronous interactions, it's this. The point is that we recognize that a one-size-fits-all solution is very difficult to come by, given the different types of modalities that we're working with, and that's part of the reason for proposing these changes. So we're looking for something that gives adequate flexibility to institutions and potentially to accrediting agencies, if they're the ones that'll do these definitions, to come up with something that works for people while still meeting the letter of the law, which we have to do. Okay, we can go on now.
So I think Jessica, you had it up and then you brought it down, so I recognize you, then it's Amanda. Okay.
Could you send us that Dear Colleague letter and maybe a blanket request for any time there are Dear Colleague letters that are relevant to what we're talking about, to send them if you can?
Well, I think it's best if I send a link to the Dear Colleague. I mean, I don't see any reason to put it in a PDF. I'll just send you the link to it, and you can click on it and go retrieve it from. It'll be a link to IFAP. But yes, I can we can definitely send you the links to any Dear Colleague letters that we reference.
Thank you. Just briefly, I would also agree, I think, with some of the instructor questions you brought up, and I am guessing this might be where Meredy would be going, but I think, like, again, with an accreditor race to the bottom, if accreditors are the ones defining what regular and substantive interaction means, an institution that wants to provide the lowest level could go searching for an accreditor that would permit them to do so.
Denise, did you want to speak? Oh, I'm sorry, no, I'm good. Okay. I give you a little precedence, so, you know. Okay, Amanda, go ahead.
So in the spirit of protecting quality of education, especially in higher ed, knowing that in distance education, students are more at risk. They're isolated more so from resources. So I understand like the concept of instructional members. I am weary and questioning of them. I don't like that the language says instructor or members of an instructional team, because to me, I'm not a lawyer, but to me that says it could be an instructor that is qualified, has a master's program, is a subject matter expert, which I would want to pay for. That's the knowledge I'm gaining. I'm gaining resources and their background and their experiences. When I'm paying for an education, I'd want a subject matter expert that's going to give me the skills to work in the workforce, be hired by employers. It's what makes higher education worth it. But to have or as that says that, to me, it's like, well, we can choose to provide, if I'm an institution, I could choose to provide a subject matter expert or an instructional team, which may or may not be subject matter experts. They may be surface level experts, maybe not experts at all. So that's very dangerous. That's dangerous to me. I would want to make sure and protect students, especially knowing that they're more risk averse in these programs, to make sure that they're provided and protected with this bare minimum should be a subject matter expert for a fact. Instructional teams, that's an interesting concept, and I think that's a separate conversation, I think, that needs to be hashed out more. But definitely as a standard, federal standard, subject matter expert would really need to be clarified and protected.
I believe Meredy's next.
Yeah, I encourage us to be careful with the term faculty, because different states, different unions, that term can hold a lot that we in this room may not get our arms around. So I think we need to be careful when we use that particular term. I'm in favor of the instructional teams because I do think in many places we have it broken out where different people, and we use the example of a traditional institution where GA may provide a lot of the work and or the grading, and you still have an instructor of record. I do think we could work on the language to ensure that that instructional team, that a member of that, at least one member, is a subject matter expert. And so we could break out the roles and clarify that we don't lose that expertise and then leave it to the institutions to decide how that, like I said, you may have somebody facilitating tutoring, you may have somebody assigning grades and somebody creating the material, somebody as a discussant, et cetera.
Okay, we'll take that idea back.
Okay. I believe it's Leah.
So I'm looking at these words as determined by the accrediting agency, and I'm thinking about, as I've mentioned, a lot of different accreditors or gatekeepers. A lot of accreditors might define this in different ways that could have implications for students. I'm wondering if there's, any way we could put just a little bit of scaffolding around this, and maybe it's through the recognition criteria for accreditors. I think we'd probably want to stage something there if we're going to put, this kind of responsibility on accreditors to determine what is appropriate number of times qualified faculty interact with students over the course of learning. I also think that regular has to be looked at in the context of the types of interactions in the substantive piece, because you can have lots of regular contact that does nothing for the student. If it's not good quality engagement, a school can document the heck out of doing things once a week But if the accreditor, doesn't have a good process in place to kind of look at what's going on between students and faculty, then we're probably not going to see outcomes being met and those types of things. So I don't have a suggestion for you, David, on what to put there, but it is giving me a great deal of pause as determined, and maybe language like as assessed, as evaluated, as verified might be stronger.
Well, can I ask a quick question about your first proposal? So the concept with this language as you're reading it is that these are the general requirements for how the accrediting agency defines it. But I think you were suggesting something else about the recognition criteria. If you have thoughts about that, you can let us know. But I think that's something that we can look at.
Right. I mean, the recognition criteria is basically silent on how accreditors deal with regular and substantive interaction. It doesn't say anything. It says accreditors have a process for reviewing distance ed, has standards for reviewing distance ed, but it never touches on the gatekeeping role of regular and substantive.
So you're right. The current law doesn't indicate that. In the proposed language that we have that was discussed during the main committee, we did include, and it may not be as robust as what you just described, but we have a paragraph that indicates that they need to have a definition of distance education and correspondence that is sufficient to distinguish between the two, and that relies on this definition as the sort of foundation for how it works. But there could be other things that we would want to look at, and like I said, we're interested in that. If you think that would be helpful.
Or just add having a definition and having a robust assessment of how that definition is implemented,
Mm-hmm.
or two things.
Okay.
David?
Just a language suggestion for you, David. Under the regular section, I would, after number 1, take out 2 and 3, and at the end of 4, just add or more frequently as determined by the accrediting agency. Or more frequently. Because that's really what you're saying. And then you can abbreviate it.
Can you repeat that?
He's going to write it down.
Okay.
Jillian, did you have a comment?
Okay, that's probably intentional. I agree with the comment about let's think about how we can better define instructional team to make sure it includes, and I know I use the word faculty sloppy, so I'm sorry I don't have a better word for that. I get the nuances, especially from differences in accrediting agencies and such, but just to make sure that we're representing that there needs to be subject matter expertise represented in that term. And I have a couple comments on substantive, but I don't know if you want me to wait until...
Is there anything else on regular? Because I'd be glad to move on if we, okay. Mary.
Actually, and I feel funny because I'm like aligning with different people, depends on how it goes. So sorry, David, I'm breaking off with you. I struggle with this language a little bit because I think the accreditors are going to look at it in some way, say, or certain accreditors will say, well, obviously we should be more frequent than weekly because they stuck that in as the expectation. I think it does not hit Russell's point of view that some students or some programs may be planned to be less frequent than weekly. My concern is that in those it has to be planned and determined with the student and what is less weekly. It's not, you can't retrofit that when the accreditors come knocking at your door. So I like striking 2 and 3. I just think on 4, instead of saying or more frequently as determined by accrediting agencies, I would say, or at a frequency determined by accrediting agencies based on, something along the lines, based on a predetermined plan with the student or something. So it's understood that because we're doing this type of program, there may be a period of 3 weeks where nothing happens, at least not in interactive, but it is planned, it is programmed out. And so I'm trying to get them both together, that it could be more frequent, and occasionally it could be less frequent. Once a week, gut tells me that's probably about right. But there'd be a plan, there'd be a way for that.
So, okay. David,
Just
go ahead.
say, or frequency as determined by the accrediting agency?
So I get what you're saying, and I'm super sympathetic to it because our programs, we use subscription pricing, and it is sort of self-paced, and everybody hates that term. But I also want to make sure. So to your comment earlier, Russ, about CBE programs, totally aligned. I think we have to keep checking ourselves against the fact we don't have a CBE definition, right? So we have to think about this in the context of all distance ed. And so suggesting that that we think students can be successful hearing from their institution less than one time a week makes me just a little nervous because I'm not sure. I don't know what the right frequency is, but students are making a huge investment in their education. And I want to make sure that we're not saying the school doesn't owe the student anything in terms of providing instruction to that student on at least a weekly basis. I don't have the answer, but I just want to throw it out there as from a student success perspective and a completion perspective, I want to make sure we're giving students what we owe them too. So that was my other comment on regular. I think if we can figure out a pathway to provide flexibility in those instances where students it happens at our school too, where students say I'm not going to be here for 2 weeks or whatever. But I'd be careful against creating a blanket way to do that, I think.
Russell.
Well, thank you, Meredith. I think we probably have to do some wordsmithing here. I agree with that. But I think having something where it's planned, and I think, because I'm trying to get away from exactly what you're talking about too, where it's just the institution just has the openness to do whatever it wants, because what you're describing to me as opposed to what I'm envisioning is that it's the institution that unilaterally says that they're going to do things like take spring breaks. Oh, no, wait. They do that. So that won't fit. You can't have spring breaks anymore. So anyway that it seems like it's not the institution that's determining it, that if we have a plan or agreement or something in there where it's agreed upon by the institution and the student, that there's something that we could come up with that allows some flexibility. I'd like to see that. Also, on a different topic that I don't have the exact wording, but I think something about having the subject matter expert for the course being part of number one, or Romanet I, might be something to consider adding as well.
So then I guess on the new Romanet 2, I'd be curious to hear from you, Leah, about how equipped you feel accrediting agencies would be to do what's suggested in that writing now on a predetermined plan between the accrediting agency and the institution.
I mean, we're talking about learning settings that are often highly individualized per the student, especially if we're getting into flexible-paced, competency-based direct assessment. I don't know if we're going to solve for all of those different situations in this language here. And maybe what we need to do is have the rest of the conversations about direct assessment, subscription, competency-based, all of those other things, and maybe come back to this after we've kind of hashed through all of that, and maybe we'll be in a better place to say, okay, overarching kind of call on distance ed is this thing, and then we have a stair step for the other kinds of teaching and learning that we see in distance ed. I mean,
all right, David.
Well, just want to pose one question to the group, going back to our earlier conversation about the credit hour, in which David suggested that the concept of regular and substantive interaction is connected to it. Do you guys if we would be interested in suggestions about tying the frequency to the concept of credit hours too, if you guys think that could be helpful, because part of the purpose of the credit hour in the Title IV rules is to establish an intensity of education over a period of time, because that's how we determine the proration of Title IV aid. So that could be another route, but we're interested in your thoughts about that.
Go ahead, Denise.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but we have another session right before we go back to the committee. So, I mean, it's just some of these things we can think about about dealing with the competency-based and context of the language. We have a little bit of time, and then we'll have another meeting together to come up with the language. So, like Leah said, we might be able to go back, look at the rest of the stuff, then come back maybe and deal with the language instead of trying to do it piecemeal. It might make more sense to go through.
I just want to clarify, though, based on that comment, but there's not a hook, your language, there's not a hook for a definition for CBE, correct? I mean, I'm assuming y'all thought about that as one option of something you would do.
I need to go back and look again, because I'm dealing with this more in the compliance end, because that's the area that I deal with is the enforcement compliance end. So I want to talk to some of my colleagues and to see what we think in terms of a hook for that.
Amanda?
I'm sorry. I just want to point out one. I'm not suggesting it's not my place to say what you adopt and what you don't, but I just throwing this out there. So we currently have at least once under regular, at least once per week for a non-term program, at least equal to the number of weeks in a term for a term-based program. So the limitations that I think Russell was talking about don't really come into play with term, because it's just there's a number, but it doesn't have to be every week. So could we consider, is there a compelling reason that we all see why we couldn't loosen up at least once per week for non-term and keep the same standard as we have for term-based, that was equal to the number of weeks, so that we establish some floor for a number of interactions, but allowing for the fact that in some cases of some students, it might not be every week.
But I think there's not a prescribed definition of how long a non-term, because non-term works a lot now with self-paced programs. So I don't know as an institution how many times I'm supposed to reach out to my student if we do that, because it could take them 3 weeks or it could take them 30 weeks.
That's a very good point. Depending upon their pace, it could take a long time. I mean, you could go on published length of the program, right? I mean, yes, it could take a very number of times, but you still do have a published length of the program and number of terms. I'm just trying to find a way we can get around. We can get to accommodating what Russell's talking about, which I think is a real need, but not just taking away a standard completely. Saying, well, because if we say, well, at least once per week, except when you don't want to do once per week, that I think might be a little loose. I'm trying to find a way to balance both of those out.
You can see what we've proposed here includes basically a connection to the period of time in which the student is undergoing the instruction. And I just mentioned as another possibility, also including the concept of the credit hour, because that reflects the intensity of the instruction. So if you're taking 3 credit hours over 15 weeks, you might not expect the student to interact as often as you would if someone was taking 18 credit hours over the same period of 15 weeks. So again, and the published length of the program, as Greg just mentioned, is another way that we could potentially come up with a regularity concept. But we're interested in any thoughts that you guys have about how to come up with something that is applicable in most cases and the accreditor can work with, but that isn't too restrictive and doesn't prohibit certain kinds of modalities from functioning. So again, we don't need this to happen today, but this has been a really helpful discussion, I think, for us, because it's kind of brought up some ways that this might work, and we're interested in hearing more about that.
Okay, Amanda.
So, for at least I just want to suggest or support the language of the minimum standard that is suggested, which is like at least once a week, and yeah, I like that. I support that. Just that federal minimum standard, that at least once a week. The non-term thing, I will not say anything more about that, but I just wanted to support the first end at least.
Meredith.
I hope we save this when we come back. We remember where we were. I like the once a week too, with the exception, and I like the predetermined plan. Particularly, we're a heavily military serving institution, and that falls apart in some points. But I think if you are going to serve those populations, I think having an agreement with your accrediting agency on how you do that and what the expectations are, I think is valid, rather than just saying we think we're going to serve this population.
I think Jessica's next.
I just want to reiterate, maybe ideally more clearly, the process point that I tried to make this morning. I'm now understanding that sort of there's a bucket of making accreditation more competitive over here, and a lot of people have articulated that sort of in conflict with the bucket we've been talking about today, about sort of moving around the rules for distance ed and CBE, and we're thinking about things like credit hour and clock hour and how those impact distance ed on the one hand and brick and mortar on the other hand. And we just, none of us have, I just don't understand what people's visions are in the room, anybody, and I would think that that might help instead of starting at the red line of what is connected to what and like what is the world that you want to see with our brick and mortars regulated like distance ed or no, and if you have CBE and each, are they different or the same? So I mean, Ed, I don't know if you could provide some of that for us, or next time maybe. I'm not sure how to integrate that.
I mean, I can start, and maybe Denise or David can help me here. But from the department standpoint, from what we're trying to do, the vision here. So if you're going with the current definition of distance education, and I think that you have this definition of distance education, and it's fairly narrow in tying it to, I mean, it's distance education, but in a sense ties it to a brick and mortar type of operation, and doesn't take into account the, I like modalities. It's a new word for me to use now. I'll drop synergies and use that one. But all kidding aside, it's useful in that, this proposed language, as you see here, accommodates to a greater extent, I think, where education in a distance mode is. It's not necessarily, linked to that single instructor having that interaction with that student. So you can see here that we went to instructional team or members of instructional team. It provides a little more latitude for programs to go outside of that what was currently a fairly narrow box. I think that's really where we're coming from with it. Again, it's a floor we throw out there to have you comment on, but I think that's the driving force behind it, really. David, do you want anybody?
I think that's right, Greg. So, the department is really looking to ensure that students can be served by a variety of institutions, offering a variety of different programs that address students' needs in different ways. And you can see this play out in the accreditation part of the rules as we're trying to make it a little easier for new accrediting agencies to come up and that might be able to address different kinds of programs. You see it in these rules as we're trying to accommodate, for example, clock hour programs that use distance education, and we're trying to accommodate the concept of distance education as it applies in that sector. So all of these things are designed to try to allow for new and innovative types of education that can serve students' needs well. Remembering that the last part is important. We don't want to simply throw open the doors, but we do want to find ways of bringing in types of programs that potentially don't exist in a reasonable way.
Right, Tony, after your comment.
I've got 5 placards up at the moment. Oh, all right. Make me a liar. You, out. No, all right. So, all right, now I only have several. I was going to suggest that we go to 3, Greg, and then take a 15-minute break. And then whoever hasn't been recognized will start from there. All right, with that said, who's left here? Russell, are you going to be recognized? Because you are going to be next. Go ahead.
Darn, I was hoping you were going to do a break. Or do you think? Well, I was trying to work on something to try to tease out. It seems like we're now getting a whole lot of ideas into that, what is now Romanet 2, in terms of term and non-term. So I was playing here with trying to come up with something where you try to break out for a term that's at least once a week, and for the non-term, still would like to see something where, and I was thinking more rather than that it had to be approved between the accrediting agency and the institution, that it was a student-institution agreement. You know, maybe that format is approved by the accrediting agency and the institution, but we see those sorts of things that are reviewed by financial aid over time, where, you know, there's differences among the students that the institution's able to do, and that there be some allowance for that. Therefore, it's not the back to what I said before, it's not the institution implemented, it's only when the institution is meeting a student's needs. And so I was trying to play with some wording here. Haven't got it done yet. But.
As an institution that has and also has a very large population of military students, I'm very sensitive to that population. And I go back to, because I'm one of those non-traditional learners that got my bachelor's degree when I was 30 years old with 2 kids and working a full-time job. So I don't want to see us lose sight of what non-traditional means. And at the same time, obviously, we want to have an academic program that has, obviously, you know, meets the requirements of the accrediting agency. And at our institution, just to say, we do have shared governance, and we have someone who, you know, our council of faculty who step in and say this program has to be delivered this way, and that is their job. And I want that to be their job. I don't want that to be financial aid to have any part of that. However, I don't want to see us, I'm going to use my mother's language, throw the baby out with the bathwater and put something in language that's going to be very hard to apply to a population such as the military or other online students. I think that by saying it has to be every week or every, twice a week because you're only an 8-week program or whatever the case may be, could cause some problems down the road for those, again, non-traditional students. I use that, and I know that's probably not the latest buzzword, but like modality, Greg, I'm not sure about that one. But I'm just saying, I think that we just can't lose sight of that when we're doing this definition. I don't want to see us put it so strict that then it becomes something that, once again, those of us that have been in aid a very, very long time will have a hard time interpreting the regulation. We'll have a hard time saying, yes, this meets this definition.
Thank you. I think, Carol, you had something to say, but you...
I'm sorry. Perhaps through wordsmithing. I was just a little confused because it seemed like the end of the new section 2, thank you, was maybe modifying the wrong part. I think it might just be a wordsmithing issue because it doesn't totally do what we had talked about it maybe doing the way it is.
That's right.
Perfect. Thanks.
All right. And then Leah.
Oh, we're just hung up on weeks, right? We just can't benchmark against anything except a week. And you had said, David, what else is there? I mean, because that's how we award financial aid, is in these chunks of time. And I guess, is there a way we could consider benchmarking against student accomplishments along the way, as reviewed and assessed by the accreditor? That could be applied in any learning setting, not just distance ed, but it seems like our huge hang up here is, for some reason, there's something magical about 7 days. And somehow that's tied to how students learn and interact with faculty and go along their learning continuum. So I was just wondering if we could play with some language around that idea.
Could you repeat really quickly what you just said, the language? You said something about student.
I said, instead of benchmarking against weeks, we benchmark against assessment of student, learning and accomplishments along the continuum of their, program of study or their course at that time. So the accreditor has assessed the intervals along that learning continuum, that those are appropriate points to do an assessment, that it's being evaluated appropriately by the right qualified people. And so we're using benchmarking in terms of student learning and not at a week.
Thank you.
Denise, did you have something?
Well, no, I think the difficulty we're having is the statute says regular, and if you look up Webster's definition of regular, it's intervals, and so I think the easiest thing for the department was an interval is the week.
It can also be a unit of learning.
Right. So, I mean, I think all this is good for us to take back, but just recognizing that we got to stick within the parameters of the statute, that's all.
And
It's a little difficult trying to mesh something that was written a long time ago with the new modalities that we have.
well, and this is because of the fact that I've been eating too much sugar, but Greg and Denise will remember that we had an assistant secretary once that liked the word fortnight, and I think that would be a very pithy idea. Right. So, Jillian?
So I think this is a good time to stop, and when we come back, we'll start talking about substantive, since we're only halfway through now.
So why don't we take a 15-minute break now? And I'm just going to splurge and say come back at 10 after. together now, and I want to defer to Scott first.
I just have some housekeeping announcements as we're going into the afternoon session. The first is I'm passing around to everybody contact information for the subcommittee as well as all the main committees as well. So feel free to take one. It probably has Carolyn's on here. If you had the previous one from yesterday, it would not have had hers. But for me, this is the first time I've had it, so I have been unable to forward that dear colleague letter until this point, which I will do once we finish with today's meeting. Second item, at the end of the day, please remember to leave your badges and your name tags here or your nameplates here. We will take care of those for tomorrow. If there is any type of inclement weather tomorrow that affects our starting time, please check with the OPM website. That's opm.gov/status, and it will give you the operating status of the federal government. If there is any type of delay, it will tell you there. We consider our start time at 9 a.m. here, so if it's a 1 hour delay, we will start at 10. If it's a 2 hour delay, we will start at 11. And if somehow there's a blizzard that comes through tonight and we're all canceled, we will see you in a month. If there is no delay, we will start again at 9, which is what we hope will happen. And just as we go back, during the break, Russ emailed me some language that I have now put up on the screen in the actual Word section. The notes on the side, just, are the previous iterations that people suggested, so I didn't lose those. So that's something for you to be able to look at as we move back into the content. Thank you.
Thanks, Scott. All right. Well, we've clearly tackled regular. Let's start talking about substantive. Okay,
Jillian, did you have something?
Yeah.
All right. You already have your flag up, huh?
She's got that placard up already. That's all right. All right. So let me go through the definition here. So under 3, substantive means, and under Romanet 1. Interactions within a course or program between a student and instructors or members of instructional teams, as defined in Part 2 of this definition. We know that all needs wordsmithing, but that's pointing to under Romanet 2 under 3 here. And a distance learning curricula that monitors progress and provides feedback, including through self-paced distance learning, where the student's progress is evaluated or competency is assessed. And then 2 here, which is just describing what an instructional team is. This may address at least some, but maybe not all, of the comments we've had before. The various members of instructional teams may have different and complementary roles and qualifications as required by the accrediting agency, such as to share information, answer questions, provide direct instruction, provide assessment or feedback, monitor a student's academic progress, or provide student support directly related to the student's success in a particular course. Romanet 3. General academic advisors or counselors are not considered to be members of instructional teams for the purpose of identifying substantive interactions. And 4, a student must be provided with feedback designed to support his or her learning and success. All right, I'll stop there and turn it over to Jillian. And other comments, of course.
Okay, so I have a few comments here. Sorry to be redundant, but I just want to point out again that we're not talking in here at all about subject matter expertise. So I think there needs to be an edit somewhere, and I'm happy to chat through maybe what that looks like. But I still feel like the way instructional team is constructed, you could either have an instructional team that doesn't have any subject matter expertise on it, or you could have an institution could have an instructional team that has somebody that has subject matter expertise on it, but actually never engage that person to interact with students, right? So I'm concerned about creating the conditions where it sort of becomes for show that a team is created, but it's really just the least expensive member of that team that gets tasked with doing the work. So I'd like to see those things addressed in sort of future iterations of this. And the monitor in Romanet 1, where it says monitors progress and provides feedback. My understanding this to be sort of the only place in this definition where, so before I say that, I would say, I think this definition actually defines more interaction than it defines substantive. So for whatever that's worth, I found this to be a strange definition of substantive since it didn't actually talk about substantive. And related to that, monitors progress and provides feedback seems like a really low floor in terms of what we expect to see from an instructor. I mean, I akin this to sort of, the minimum for an instructor to do is to grade as as opposed to providing learning or teaching. So I'm not sure the solution for that, but I'd be really careful. I'd prefer to see it not in there at all, I guess, as opposed to like setting that as a floor, because it feels like a really low minimum. And then regarding, let's see, Romanet 3, general academic advisors or counselors are not considered to be members of instructional teams. So I get what you're doing here. Again, our FlexPath program, we use what I would call general academic advisors, though I think my institution would probably try and make the case that they are more than general academic advisors. We call them a coach. So I don't want to regulate on the definition of general academic advisors, but it also seems like a risky area in terms of like who is making the call on what a general academic advisor is. Because I think my institution maybe would say coaches are not general academic advisors, there's so much more. I would say, no, they're probably general academic advisors.
That's a good point. Now, I would point out that my understanding of the purpose of this is to ensure that an academic advisor that is doing work that really isn't directly related to the program or the specific coursework is not considered to be part of an instructional team, whereas someone who is working with the student with respect to their actual coursework is. But I take your point that the concept might inadvertently sweep up more than we intended it to. So we're interested in comments about how we can avoid that.
Denise.
I just wanted to ask Jillian, so what do your coaches do?
So
in order to get context.
Yeah, so they do all the probably normal things that an advisor does, right? Like help people register and et cetera. They also monitor individual students' progress and reach out to them if they're not engaging on a regular basis. They have access to provide to students in terms of pointing them to resources to help them. So I'm thinking like the Writing Center or let me provide you with like a time management module, et cetera. Those are probably the main things that they do. So I would say it's like
and then we keep getting back.
And
to
it's not course specific. So this person follows
not course specific or subject matter
the program.
specific.
No, follows the program. Follows the
and that's what your
program.
concerns are.
Yeah, I'm concerned about if that's the only instructor on an instructional team, a student's going to get a really poor educational experience.
David?
David, I had a question for you regarding the subject matter expert. Am I remembering that there's something in at least in the guidance language about that?
That's right. In the 2014 Dear Colleague letter, which is Gen 14-23, part of what we indicate is necessary to have someone be classified as an instructor is that, and I'm not going to get the quote exactly right, but Scott is going to send this out to you guys, is that the staff member needs to meet accrediting agency requirements for instruction in the subject matter under discussion. So, for example, you couldn't have someone who is interacting with a student talking about the weather. That wouldn't count. But you also couldn't have someone who is an English instructor talking to a student about his calculus homework. That doesn't count. And nor would it count for anyone without any subject matter expertise to count under that blanket concept. So that's the general rule.
I think having at least one degree higher than the degree that the students are pursuing.
We don't establish that anywhere in our guidance. Accrediting agencies sometimes have that requirement, but it's not something specific that we established.
Okay. So I'm thinking of HLC, but so maybe somehow make sure that that type of person is on a team, right? So include that in the language.
And also,
somehow.
like, I don't know how to solve against that person not ever engaging with the student, right? So like I can make a team that's like you and me, and you're the really smart one, and I'm the idiot, and I'm the only one communicating with the student. But
yeah,
I made a team, and you're on it, so it counts.
My only concern is, again, so we don't have double standards between online and face-to-face in that regard. Because there are plenty of institutions that dump students onto TAs.